Hello, everyone. We'll get started in a minute. Since it's only 1 o'clock and 30 seconds, we'll give it another minute or so. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you're having a nice Sukkot. The Sukkot, of course, at least in our house, feels a little different. Usually, for the last 8 years, Julia and I have thrown a huge party for the community, excuse me, in our backyard with a DJ and a pizza oven and a little bar, and adults have come by, and we've had hundreds on this one night. We do it on the Saturday night of Sukkot, and had to always send a little note and a little gift to all of our neighbors in the neighborhood to let them know about what was coming our way. But it was sad not to have that party this year. It was definitely always a highlight of Sukkot in a really nice way in the fall to gather people together. So I'm looking forward to bringing that back, hopefully next year. So, okay, well, our final session. Hard to believe, 29 sessions. We started this back in March. I was just talking to Don Levy, and I want to first start with my gratitude to Don Levy, our head of communications, and also to Hannah Gohl and to Jessica Reisenberg, all of whom at one point or another have been behind the scenes helping to make sure that technologically and in every other way that this is happening. So I really want to offer gratitude to them and for all that they've done to make this and all the other learning sessions and so much more available for all of us. But I was just talking to Don before we went live about, he really helped me to see. I was talking about how I'm sad that this is coming to an end. It's been truly the highlight of my week since the pandemic began. And he said, you should just see this as you're now going on hiatus until season 2, and that you can take a little sabbatical from this and prepare for what the next season is going to look like, because I definitely feel like I am not done teaching Talmud, and there's so much more left in this Talmud for us to study together. So really, I'm trying to see this as the end of season 1, and hopefully, God willing, we'll have a season 2 at some point in the future. So I want us to study one last text together, and then to conclude. No one reached out to me to say they wanted to teach a little something. So I'll take that as you want to just learn another story. So we're going to learn another story, and then we'll conclude with, of course, any insights on that story or any other brief insights that anyone else wants to share. And then I do want to conclude with a traditional prayer that I'll share on the screen with you, that is done when you complete a section of Talmud. So I thought that would be a nice kind of ritual for us to end our time together today. So let's get started. As always, we'll go through it. You know how this works. You can raise your virtual hand, put things in the Q&A or in the chat function, and after I go through it once or twice, then we'll open it up to your thoughts and interpretations. So we'll begin, of course, with the blessing for engaging in the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who commands us to engage in the study of Torah. All right, so let's get to it. An interesting story this week. I guess they're all interesting. For this one, there are a variety of characters. Many of the stories that we've studied together are pretty limited in the number of characters involved. Here we have a little bit more of a complex dynamic of characters. So we'll walk through that after I read through it just once straight through the first time, and then we'll go break it down again together. All right. So this is from Baba Batra 22a. Rav Dimi from Nehardia brought a load of dried figs in a boat to sell them. Said the exilarch to Rava, "Go see if he is a scholar rabbi, then reserve the market for him." Rava said to Rav Ada bar Abba, "Go, smell his jar, test his learning." He went and asked him, "If an elephant swallowed a twig basket and expelled it with his excrement, what is the law as to whether or not it is still a utensil, therefore subject to uncleanness, Or is it simply excrement? He didn't know. He said to Rav Ada, "Are you Rava?" He struck him on his sandal and said to him, "Between me and Rava is there a considerable distance. Nonetheless, I can be your master, and Rava, the master of your master." So they did not assign a market stall to him, and his figs were a total loss. He came before Rav Yosef and said to him, "Look, master, at what they did to me." He said to him, "He who did not hold back vengeance for the wrong done to the king of Edom will not hold back the vengeance for the wrong done to him. As it is written, thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Moab, yes, for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he burned the bones of the king of Edom into lime." So Rav Ada bar Abba died. Rav Yosef said, "I am the one who punished him because I cursed him." Rav Dimi of Nahardia said, "I am the one who punished him because he made me lose my figs." Abaye said, "I am the one who punished him, for he used to say to the students, instead of chewing on bones in Abaye's household, go, eat fat meat at Rava's." Rava said, "I'm the one who punished him, because when he went to the butcher to buy meat, he would say to the butcher, 'Serve me before Rava's servant, because I am better than he.'" Rav Nachman bar Isaac said, "I am the one who punished him." For Rav Nachman bar Isaac was head of the public assembly. Every time he went to give his public address, he would review his tradition with Rav Ada bar Ava. Then he would go to the public assembly. One day, Rav Papa and Rav Huna bar Ben Rav Yehoshua took hold of Rav Ada bar Ava because they had not been at the concluding address of Rabbah on Tractate Bechorot. They said to him, "Tell us about the traditions concerning tithing cattle. How did Rabbah say them?" He said to them, "This is what Rabbah said, and that is what Rabbah said." In the meantime, dusk came, and Rav Nachman bar Isaac was still waiting for Rav Ada bar Abba. Said the sages to Rav Nachman bar Isaac, "Come on, it's late. Why are you still in session?" He said to them, "I am sitting and waiting for the beer of Rav Ada bar Abba." In the interim, a rumor spread that Rav Ada bar Abba had died. It stands to reason that it was Rav Nachman bar Isaac who had punished him. Okay, hard to follow, definitely, especially if you're reading this for the first time. It's like lots of names, a little confusing what's going on here. So let's go back. We'll try and break it down. Of course, we have the 2 main characters. Actually, there are a few sections here, so it's almost as though there are a variety of stories interwoven here. We have Rav Dimi, who is the one at the very beginning of the story, who is a visiting rabbi to a town. He ends up later becoming the head of the academy in Pumbedita, a very famous academy in Babylonia. But here we're to assume he's a young man. He's coming to sell figs, right? And so he's come with these figs to sell. A little bit of background about where we are in this conversation in the Talmud. In Baba Batra 22, there's a conversation about what are the benefits that Torah scholars should get economically in the business world. And there's a conversation about, okay, Torah scholars should get some prime real estate in the markets in order to sell their wares, so that they can sell their wares and then go ahead and continue learning, but that they can still make a living. So that's where this story kind of falls into the greater picture here. And so we now are focusing on this one story about this one man, Rav Dimi, who comes and he's going to want to sell his figs at the market. And so we have a conversation between him and a messenger who is sent to him, who is Rav Ada bar Abba. And Rav Ada bar Abba has this exchange with him that is not so great, leads to some negative repercussions in the very end, which of course is the death of Rav Abba bar Abba, whatever, Ada bar Abba. And then it switches to now a whole group of people who are talking about the ways in which Rav Ada used to act and how maybe they're the ones to blame for why he's actually dead. And then at the end, we kind of have a mini story that's supposed to be one of those reasons given as to why he dies. And it's that final story that's given that is said, okay, that final story, that's the reason why he actually died. Okay, so that's a broad overview. Now let's go and kind of dig in a little, because even that's slightly confusing. And today we're not going to dig so much into the Amos quote that's referenced there. just for time's sake. But let's go through it and see if we can try and understand this a little bit more. Again, as we're going through this, what are we supposed to learn from this story? Not only are we supposed to, what are we supposed to learn about what not to do based on Rav Ada bar Abba and his actions? The way he treats all of these different people is really a lesson that, even though this is in the context of economic prioritization of the Talmudic rabbis, in the market area, that really this is really about how one should treat other people, the role of humility, the recognition of your place in a hierarchy of learning or any structure, let's be honest, because Rav Ada bar Abba is not the highest leader in the community, and yet he acts as though he is top dog. So we already have that lesson kind of built in here. Let's recognize our place in the world. Let's recognize our place within our community, within our professional setting. How can you still be the strong leader you want to be without trying to pretend to be something you're not, or to act in a way that puts other people down to try and benefit yourself, which is what Rav Ada bar Abba seems to be doing. All right, so let's go back and look at the story one more time, and then of course, open it up to your interpretations. All right, going back to the top. Rab Dimi from Nehardia brought a load of dried figs in a boat to sell them. Okay, we already talked about it. He was coming to a new area, and so he wants to sell these figs. Said the Exlarch, who really was the political authority of the town at the time, said to Rabbah, who was a main religious leader, go see if he is a scholar rabbi, then reserve the market for him. So as I mentioned before, in the context of where we are in the Talmud, this is a conversation about should there be preference given to Torah scholars to sell their wares in order that they can make a living and then go and learn more Talmud. So here we have a routine procedure. Just the Exlarch is saying to the rabbi, you're a leader. This guy is coming in. He's a rabbi. Just go make sure that he's a scholar. And therefore, we can give him that prime real estate in the market so that he can sell his wares, because as the conversation said, Torah scholars should get some preferential treatment when it comes to the market. So then Rava turns around and says to Rav Ada bar Abba, okay, you go. Rava's not going to go. You go, Rav Ada bar Abba, and go test this guy's learning, which is now shifting the conversation a little from just a routine procedure of making sure he's a legitimate rabbi to, okay, let's dig a little deeper here. So maybe Rav wants Rav Ada bar Abba to do that because we have a new Torah scholar coming to our town and we want to understand who he is and what's his background and what's his style of learning. But we'll see that Rav Ada takes it in a different direction, kind of takes it more than just seeing if this guy knows the basic ABCs of Talmud and Torah, and instead follows up with this crazy question. He went and asked him, if an elephant swallowed a twig basket and basically then pooped it out, what is the law about whether or not that basket is subject to being unclean or is simply just excrement? Really weird question, right? And really a very detailed question about, of course, something that seems completely ridiculous, and also is probably about a very obscure type of scholarship that not all the rabbis at that time understood or knew anything about. When the hint being this idea of uncleanness, of purity, most of the times the laws of purity and impurity sometimes had to do with the laws of the temple. We can imagine this, of course, is after the time of the temple, probably hundreds of years after the second temple was destroyed. So referencing something that is so, not relevant to the day-to-day lives of these rabbis is an interesting choice by Rav Ada. It's almost as though he is trying to prove his own intelligence, and also in the process of trying to prove himself, trying to minimize and undermine any authority that Rab Dimi is bringing. So he's really trying to brag and show how intelligent he is by asking a question that's so ridiculous. We can all imagine and think about those people, whether we were in class as a student or whether we are as an adult, seeing those people who like to present themselves with knowing everything and do it in such a way that seems to try and diminish anyone else's intelligence, right? So we're starting to understand the character of Rav Ada bar Abba through this question that he asks. Now, the answer, Rav Dimi doesn't know the answer to that. I mean, it's a ridiculous, crazy question of all the things he should be asking him. And so Rav Dimi says to Rav Ada, are you Rava? Now, we don't know exactly if it's because he's new to town. He doesn't know, he's never met Rava. Rava's the head of the yeshiva. So is he talking to the head of the yeshiva? Or is this a way of saying, well, you're not the authority in this town. Why are you asking such a ridiculous question? Or just a simple question of, are you Rava? Just curious. Again, Rav Ada Bar Abba responds in a way that instead of having a conversation, he's throwing, literally in this case, physically attacking this man, but before was attacking him through an intellectual pursuit that actually was not a pure intellectual pursuit, right? So already, I think now we've been presented with two warnings that we have to think about in our own lives. If you're going to have a conversation with someone and you are coming with any sense of authority, whether that is just because you are inviting a guest in, someone who is new, or whether or not you are coming from a learned place in a subject matter or a subject of life experience, how do you approach the ways in which you have that conversation with someone else? Not the way Rav Ada does it. You don't try and throw intellectual and highfalutin language at someone purely to prove yourself, because actually what that does is undermines any authority that you have and actually puts you in a position of coming off as not a good person at all. Here, he then even follows that up by literally striking him on his sandals as if he like tries to step on his toe. And when the Rav Dimi asks this simple question, are you Rava? And he says to him, between me and Rava, there is a considerable distance. You know, Rava is much more learned than I am. Nonetheless, I can be your master, and Rava the master of your master. I can be your teacher. Let me be your teacher. Let me show you the ways of the world. How often have we come into contact with people who feel as though they can guide us through life or guide us through a situation in a way that is not holding our hand, but kind of pushing us forward towards something, or trying to lead us from a place of not of humility at all, but of ego, and of misplaced strength, when actually the strength that they are showing is actually a sign of insecurity and weakness as opposed to strength, right? Think about those people who may come off as very strong, very confident people. Many times underneath that may be a real sense of insecurity or weakness that this person is trying to cover up. So we clearly know the Rav Ada Bar Abba being reminded here that he's not Rava is also being reminded by Rav Dimi that he is not the big cheese, right? And he doesn't have the authority. And so he responds by being reminded of his place by physically lashing out at Rav Dimi. And so they did not assign a market stall to him, and his figs were at a total loss. Something happened in between the moment where they had this exchange and Rav Ada Bar Abba going back to Rava, who goes back to the Exilarch. And what ends up happening is poor Rav Dimi doesn't even get a stall to sell his figs, and then his figs are destroyed. He loses all economic opportunity to support himself and his family because of this exchange with Rav Ada. Rav Ada undermines his ability to provide for himself, and it's as if Rav Ada has punished him. And as a result, poor Rav Dimi is left with nothing. So Rav Dimi goes before Rav Yosef, who's another rabbi, not Rava, and says to him, look, master, what they did to me. I mean, how unjust that this occurred to me. He said to him, well, now this is Rav Yosef responding to him saying, he who did not hold back vengeance for the wrong done to the king of Edom will not hold back the vengeance for the wrong done to you. In other words, you deserve some vengeance here, a little revenge. Like, this is not fair. There needs to be some justice done here. Thus says, and then he quotes Amos, thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Moab, yes, for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he burned the bones of the king of Edom into lime. Okay, so now this really intense line from Amos, which talks about multiple transgressions, which is foreshadowing for what's going to come right after this. And also this idea of burning the bones of the king of Edom into lime, like a really powerful response, a really angry response, that this is such an injustice. And the way in which Rav Ada went about his engagement and interaction with Rav Dimi was so hurtful and painful and unjust, and on so many levels, some of which we just covered. So here we then are moving into the fact that, okay, it's time for you to get some justice, but, and what's the justice that comes? Rav Ada bar Abba dies. Okay, all of a sudden he dies. We don't know exactly how or why. We assume it's somehow linked to Rav Yosef's comments, but what's going on here? So now we move to this second part of the story, which is now we learn a little bit more about Rav Ada's history. And I think this is also interesting if you think about when someone passes away, what we learn about them after they're gone. So on a personal level, we just had a memorial service for my step-grandfather, who really was my grandfather, this past weekend on Zoom. And there were parts of his early life that I hadn't been even aware of, even though I had spent time with him growing up. There were pieces about him growing up in a town of 150 people in Montana, and some of the stories about that and some of the pictures that I hadn't seen. Pieces of his history and his story that weren't revealed until after he died. And so much of that happens with so many of us and the people that we love. And, you know, I have both the benefit and the challenge of helping people through those times of loss and learning about people's histories, which is always fascinating. And here I think this is a link to, now we want to be remembered for the good things, but there are also those negative things that we can't escape, and that are sometimes revealed only after death. And here we have some of the things that are revealed after Rav Ada's death, that we learn about him. So Rav Joseph said, Rav Yosef, the one who just quoted Amos right above, I'm the one who punished him because I cursed him. It's because of what I did and what I said that Rav Ada died. Rav Dimi ben Nahardia said, I'm the one who punished him because he made me lose my figs. It's because of the injustice he did and because of that exchange that I punished him through and basically wished him dead. And therefore it's my fault that he died. Abaye, who hadn't showed up anywhere up until this point in the story, said, I am the one who punished him, for he used to say to the students, instead of chewing on bones in Abaye's household, go, eat fat meat at Rava's. Remember, Rav Ada bar Abba was a student of Rava's. So here we have a competitor, so to speak, another teacher who has his own yeshiva and his own students. And here, what Rav Ada bar Abba used to do was say, don't waste your time with Abaye. He can't really teach you the way that Rava can teach you. So leave him. Like, what? Why are you chewing on bones? In other words, why are you just looking for just the scraps, the very last edges of the meat? Come, eat the real thing. Come get the real learning at Rava's. So instead of seeing scholarship as a partnership between people, really, instead of going towards the real Jewish value of debate from a place of for the sake of heaven, here Rav Ada is seeing competition instead of collaboration. And again, that's one of the big challenges not only do we face in our society right now, but a value that is being placed on the Jewish experience, which is, instead of trying to divide, instead of being competitive, can we see a way of being collaborative? And if only we could work on that, not only in the Jewish community, but in the greater society, that would be a wonderful thing. So clearly Rav Ada is someone who tries to divide as opposed to bring people together. And so Abaye thinks it's for that reason that he died. Then we have Rava, who said, I am the one who punished him, because when he went to the butcher to buy meat, he would say to the butcher, serve me before Rava's servant, because I am better than he. Okay, this to me is the most straightforward one. Clearly someone who completely lacks humility, and who also sees that there are that socioeconomic differences lead to a hierarchy of what it can be expected, right? In other words, because he wasn't a servant, because he was a rabbi, therefore he should get preferential treatment and he should be served before the servant. When in fact, if it should probably be the opposite. And to me, this reminds me of the fact that through this pandemic, we've learned, and I hope gained an appreciation for all those people who deliver all those Amazon packages, for all the people doing Instacart and all of the things that we haven't been able and willing to go out and do, the people who have been on the front lines doing that for us. So not just even the doctors and the nurses, but the people who have been out there making a lot less money, who have been doing some of the hardest work in order to keep the rest of us safe. And here's a man who doesn't respect what it means to serve. And being a servant in a way can be an extremely powerful position that we all in some way, right, we're supposed to be servants to God in a sense, but that if we can have the humility of recognizing that no matter what our position is in society, in the family, in a community, if we can all be servants every once in a while and serve other people, it goes back to the same idea of tzedakah. When people give tzedakah, it almost is more beneficial to the person giving that tzedakah than to the person receiving it. There is such value that comes from serving others. And some of us who are in serving positions in order to serve other people, I think can feel that. So for me, for a rabbi to not recognize the value of serving others is a real failure of Rav Ada. And that we all should understand the value of what it means to serve others. Okay, then Rav Nachman bar Isaac said, I'm the one who punished him. So now we're going to get into a story that is part 3. We had all these examples. We had Rav Yosef, number 1, Rav Dimi, number 2, Abaye, number 3, Rava, number 4. And remember, there were 4 references in the quote that Amos that Rav Yosef had brought up in the page right above. And here we have the final story about why Rav Ada bar Abba died. And it has to do with Rav Nachman bar Isaac. And he said, I'm the one who punished him. For Rav Nachman bar Isaac was head of the public assembly. So he'd go out and he would give lectures, and he would be the one to give the public address, and he would review his tradition. He would review what he was going to say and some of the things that he was going to reference with Rav Ada bar Abba before he would go out and give his lectures. So we could assume that Rav Ada bar Abba, in a way, was serving Rav Nachman by being a source of, back then, people memorized, since Talmud was an oral tradition, and it's considered the oral Torah, there were literally people whose entire jobs were to memorize what was being taught, to memorize certain teachings and rules and laws so that it could be referenced later on. So maybe it's that Rav Ada bar Abba was someone who literally had to keep a lot of stuff in his head and was the person who would help prepare Rav Nachman for his lectures, kind of like the scholar's assistant. And one day, Rav Papa and Rav Huna bar ben Rav Yehoshua took hold of Rav Ada bar Abba because they had not been to the concluding address of Rava on Tractate Bechorot. One day, these 2 rabbis who had missed a lecture that they wanted to hear by Rava, not Rav Nachman, but by Rava, who we've talked about before, and also Rav Ada bar Abba's teacher, because we remember he said he's a student of Rava's. And so they said to Rav Ada bar Abba, tell us about what he taught. I mean, what did Rava teach about the tithing cattle, and what did he say? And so Rav Ada bar Abba spends his time and basically retells the entire lecture to these 2 rabbis, Rav Papa and Rav Huna. In the meantime, Rav Nachman is still waiting for Rav Ada bar Abba to come and help him prepare for this public address that he's supposed to give. There are people waiting there to hear this lecture by Rav Nachman. He's supposed to get up in front of a crowd and teach them. And Rav Nachman is still waiting for Rav Ada so he could review his material and be ready to go out and give his lecture. And so even the people who are waiting there say, come on, it's getting late. Why are you still in session? Why are you not coming out and teaching us? Come on, let's get going with this. We want to learn. Already, the disrespect of Rav Ada bar Abba extends not only to Rav Nachman, who he is now making wait for him. There's no texting, there's no cell phones to say, hey, sorry, I'm running late, I'm on my way. None of that, of course, at the time. Instead, he puts his desire to prove his intelligence ahead of his responsibilities in order to try and get approval from Rav Papa and Rav Huna. And as a result, he's being disrespectful to the man who's supposed to help. And even more so, it extends to being disrespectful to all the people who are waiting for Rav Nachman to teach them. So again, we have the lesson that our actions have an impact well beyond what we may even imagine. And in this case, the negative repercussions of when we focus so much on ourselves, on feeling good about how great we are, which of course has to do probably with our own insecurities. But when we do that, when we spend our energy doing that, we are focusing on the wrong thing, and the repercussions are extremely detrimental, not only to us, but to all the other people who are relying on us to actually do what we're supposed to do. We have to be genuine with the kind of person we want to be and can be, and not try and be something we're not. Okay, so he goes, then he said, I'm sitting and I'm waiting for the beer of Rav Ada bar Abba. Now, of course, that's the coffin holder, right? So when someone was taken from one place to the cemetery, the coffin would go on this platform and they'd be carried to the cemetery. So he makes a comment. We don't know if he's joking. We don't know if he's really upset. My guess is he's pretty upset that Rav Ada bar Abba hasn't come. So when they say, why aren't you teaching us yet? He said, well, I'm waiting for the coffin. That guy's dead to me. Rav Ada he's referring to. And as a result, a rumor spread at the same time that Rav Ada bar Abba had died. Here we go. Rav Nachman had just talked about how he's waiting for this guy's coffin, and then a rumor goes around, and all of a sudden, people come rushing into the room to say, "Oh, guys, did you hear that Rav Ada bar Abba is dead?" Just at the same time as Rav Nachman had just declared that he's waiting for this guy's coffin. And so it stands to reason that Rav Nachman bar Isaac had been the one who punished him, and that it's Rav Nachman's fault, so to speak, that Rav Ada bar Abba died. Okay. Still a pretty weird thing. Of all the people, on my reading would not be that Rav Nachman is the one who is responsible for his death. If anything, I mean, think about the loss that came from Rav Dini, whose all of his figs went bad, and he couldn't sell any of them. I mean, isn't he the one who potentially has a little bit more on him to be responsible for this guy's death? Couldn't his vengefulness be the thing that really pushed things over the edge? The other things don't seem as intense, and yet when they all add up, it's interesting that is the thing at the very end that leads to his death. Is it because when we fail to follow through with the basic responsibilities that we have in life, the things that are not a one-off, but the things that we are accustomed to doing or are expected of us on a regular basis, when we fail to see those as central and actually to lift up the things that otherwise may seem mundane, but in fact are the basic pillars and the foundational elements of what it means to be who we are. That if you think about who you are and your identity, it may not be based on the prize you win, the job promotion you get, this or that. It may be really, when we think about it, the most basic elements of our life, the most basic responsibilities that we have, that when we do them well, when we are honest about those things, and when we put our heart into them, that's what defines us. And if we fail to do that, if we fail to do the basic things in our life, what that leads to is death. And of course here, I don't think it's just purely physical death. It leads to a death of respect. It leads to a death of trust. It leads to the death in the sense of maybe our memory, the memory of who we are, is going to fade away a lot faster than if we had focused on some of the most basic necessities in life and lifted those things up. And those could be the things that could serve as the foundation for our legacy to keep our memory alive much longer after we're gone than some of those other things that our society tends to lift up as the things that will really make you successful, whatever that may be. So those are a few thoughts on this story. The real warning about the importance of being humble. As I said in the title, what did I call this? Misplaced security. This idea that just because, in this case, Rav Ada, a sense of security that he had because of his position, of the relationships he had with these scholars, right? He knew a lot of people, and yet that wasn't actually security that helped him survive. That was not what was important. What was important were the basic ways in which he treated other people. And if we can remember that, if we can look at the ways in which we treat other people on the most basic level, especially those people that we don't even know, right? How we treat the stranger, that says a lot. You know, when you see someone you know and you see how they treat someone who is in a serving position, and if they don't treat that person very well, it gives you a little insight into who that person may be. And so this, I think, is a warning and a reminder that the way in which we treat every single person is essential, and that we have to make sure that we don't misplace security of our position, security of our legacy on the wrong things. That it's some of those basic building blocks that will really help us. If we can work on those can lead to true success, true deep success in our own lives. So with that, let's open it up for a little bit before we conclude with the concluding prayer that I want to just teach a little about it before we conclude it. So I will we have Merle. Hi, Merle.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so this whole teaching is so apropos of what's gone on for the last, I don't know what month we're into, 6-7 months. When you think about at the very beginning of the pandemic, when everyone was blaming airplanes and cruise ships and schools and everything, there are a couple of things here. So the first one is a friend that was criticizing all kinds of travel, and he doesn't travel. He's never been on a cruise ship. He has no desire to go on a cruise ship. And knowing people in the cruise industry, we had the real story. And we tried to explain it to him, and it turned into a fight on Facebook with all of his friends that once we talked it out, it was fine. And now he knows you don't just punch what you see on the news and assume that it's the right information. The other thing was that we have a friend who just became a physician's assistant, and she's constantly pushing meds and drugs and all kinds of stuff that she feels that most of her friends and family should be on rather than what our doctors want us on. To the point where she was here last weekend and I didn't want anything to do with her. And I was very cordial, but it's like all these people coming out in this pandemic that think they're authorities. And it's very difficult to have a conversation with them and not get yourself in trouble and not be humble and just move on. And the other thing is, you said about your great-grandfather's funeral, or your step-great, whatever.
Yeah.
I was having a meltdown about something political, and I went looking for my father's dog tags, which I knew I had somewhere. And in the box of the dog tags, there was a charm that must have belonged to my grandmother. Once some friends that speak German and could decipher it, and the jeweler who was able to polish it, we found out that this is a charm that was a thing that when babies were born in Germany, you were given this charm by your mother. And when we found out what this charm said, so I think that was something I never knew what it was. When my mother passed away, I threw it all in a box and said, I'm not wearing these dog tags, and I don't know what this charm is, but I'm sure it has something of value. And all of a sudden you find out these things about your grandparents' history that you never knew before, and it changes your whole attitude towards stuff like what's going on. And the last thing is, we find ourselves, since the beginning of all this, to this day, you don't really see your mail person. You don't really see your Amazon delivery person or whatever. We find ourselves chasing people down the street to thank them and leaving notes on our window for them, which is something I don't think we ever did before. So I'm just saying that I find all of this really relevant, because people's personalities during this pandemic and all that's gone on have really changed, and not necessarily for the good. So we have to look for the good to make it work for us. And I think that's part of being humble.
Thank you, Merle. Thank you for sharing all that. And you're right. And sometimes what's being revealed are pieces of someone's nature or personality that has been able to lie dormant because of all kinds of other things that were taking up our attention. And now like we've talked about before here, that this can bring out the best or the worst of certain parts of ourselves and other people. And you're right, and thank you for sharing about what your father's dog tags and that charm, and how so true it is that there's such mystery in even the people we know the most, and that mystery can be really beautiful to be revealed, even if it's after their time on this earth. So thank you. Esther. Hi, Esther.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. I too am a little sad that this is the end of season 1, but I'm very excited and eager for season 2 whenever that continues. One of the elements that stood out to me in the story that I wanted to comment on was, the part 2, like what was the most disrespectful, and I guess I came up with, when I looked at each of the people that saw it as disrespectful, saw his actions as disrespectful. There were a lot of names, so I'm not going to get it straight. But Nachman, who was the head of the public assembly, who in my understanding had the most people looking up to him and waiting for him and looking forward to hearing what he had to say. It seems to me that by not showing up and by missing out on that, that was, the greatest number of people were affected by that. And that had me thinking about, what we do each day and how sometimes we don't realize how many people are affected by what we do. And I mean this in a good way, and with this idea of service as well. So, in the positive, something that we see as something we just are doing as a good deed, or we're doing to feel good about ourselves, or we're doing to help someone, can really have such implications for so many people in a positive way, that when you take that away, to me, that seemed like the greatest disrespect. And so that's why, if I were arguing in favor of, Rav Nachman, then I would agree that that was probably the greatest of the transgressions.
I love that interpretation. Thank you, Esther. And I just want to point out Esther, who is our director of membership, who has worked so hard to, if we think about community and building community, and especially in the pandemic, that your job has been entirely about helping people feel the value of staying connected to a community. And so I just want to thank you for all the conversations, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of conversations that you've had with members or potential members, or anyone who has been going through what it means to be a part of something bigger during this time. And I just have to say how lucky I feel to be a part of the institution that you also work for, and for us to work together, and for you to be someone who recognizes what you just said and has worked so hard to keep people in the fold and keep them connected. So thank you for all the work that you do for the larger community. And I hope you get a sense of how meaningful and important your work is to help maintain and sustain community. So thank you for everything.
Thank you for saying that. It's my pleasure and my privilege, and I'm happy to be doing it. So thank you for that.
Okay, Gary. Hi, Gary.
Good afternoon. So to quote the ever popular Steve Brewer, you never know when you touch a child's life, is what he used to say when we were camp counselors. And I think that goes on into our entire lives, that you touch people's lives. You never quite know how or when. And I was, as you know, an executive director for close to 17 years of a synagogue. And I am still talking to people's children who were raised at the synagogue when I was executive director, because now they're grown adults. And you never know what that interaction is going to be. I think the other side of this coin is right now we're going through a lot of paperwork and things because my wife's been ill, and I just moved into a new house and trying to get rid of material, and came across, her confirmation prayer book from when she was confirmed back in Vermont in her little synagogue. And at the same time, I came across my confirmation Bible that I got at Wilshire. And so you think about who are all those people? How close are you now? And what do you do to stay connected to people? And I think the COVID has helped us stay a little closer to some people than we would have without COVID.
Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. Hi, Susan.
Unmute. Can you hear?
Yes, can.
First of all, I'm so happy you're going to be continuing teaching. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And there's so much of the Talmud. I mean, there's so many volumes of it, for goodness sake. There's only one volume of Torah or Tanakh, and there's got to be more. So thank you. The other thing is, this to me was, I mean, like a completely baffling story, and with all these names, but you spelled it out nicely and clearly. I loved it because I thought initially, what is this? And it's a great story about the elephant. I love that question. It's an excrement question. So now, and then two things in terms of the story itself. I love the conclusion at the end. It's important what you were saying, to do the basics. And I'm thinking of basics of family, of motherhood and fatherhood, and spending time with our family, which we're now doing more because of COVID, versus earlier being on a treadmill for careers and the like. So, and where will you be remembered? Your legacy will be how you brought up your children, God willing that you have children. So that was another thing that struck me. And besides the fact this guy was obnoxious on so many different levels, he deserved to die. So there is some divine justice in this, when bad things happen to bad people rather than when bad things happen to good people, as the book goes. And then I'm thinking about a funeral service there was, or at least it was a remembrance of the president of our private road here. His name will go unmentioned, but we found out he was stealing from all of us. And his wife found out that he had a mistress on the side from whom he had a condominium and lived with her. So what do you do with people that, in a funeral, being honest? He was a pleasant guy. Everyone liked him. That's how he could steal from them. So what happens with that?
Specifically with a funeral, or you mean, in other words, how do you represent someone who has a dark underbelly to their life?
And stole from you, yes, on top of it. But what this showed is all of these people talked about his dark underbelly, but then they said, I'm the one who was responsible for his death. But they didn't just say he was such a nice guy, you know. They put it out there.
Yeah, well, I think that's a valuable way of going about our lives and looking at and at what it means to be honest. That not only, you know, if we think about the holidays as this time to be honest with ourselves about our failures and what we've done wrong, we have to hold others accountable for that as well. And there are times and places where that's appropriate. I think there are certain times where it's appropriate to reveal the dark underbelly, and I think there are other times when it's not. It's when we fail to remember the complexity of each person that's dangerous, because we have to not only remember for the sake of an honest legacy for that person, but we also, I think, see any opportunity that we are remembering someone else as supposed to be a lesson on how we are supposed to act, and both as warning signs and also things that we're supposed to hold up as guides for us to improve our own lives. So I think there are times when, at a funeral specifically, that it is appropriate to talk about the dark underbelly, and for that to be a part of the story, especially when someone has caused so much pain to so many people. And there are other times where, like so many things, it's about what is the right time to talk about the right thing. And sometimes we get that right, and sometimes we don't. So that's, you know, part of the human condition of continuously trying to improve not only ourselves, but how we can identify and understand others, and how we can be honest about that. So thank you, Susan, for all your comments throughout all of these sessions, and of course for these as well. Doug White said, as a Musar student, this tale relates to the midah of honor, judging others favorably, compassion, responsibility, and loving kindness. As often happens, midot overlap. And then he says, thank you for these sessions. So thank you, Doug. Thank you for pointing out, yes, Musar, which helps us understand what is the path that we should be going on to improve ourselves, right? As with so many of the stories that we've looked at, but especially this one, as Doug points out, there's so many different lessons here of honor and judging others. And so again, I think what I like about what Doug is bringing up is that when we study Talmud, we're not just studying these stories and how they relate specifically to Talmud and other elements of Talmud or even Torah, but there is such a web of which, if we can continue to expand this lesson that we learn from this story to other things, and we can start to draw a web of how things overlap, that's how the world works. I mean, that's the complexity of the world. We should see our tradition in that same way. And I think when we uphold that complexity in that web, we start to then mirror the Jewish experience with the secular world around us, and it flows into one another, and it becomes a way in which we can start to view the world through this Jewish web and this Jewish lens. Okay, Jeff. Hi, Jeff. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. This story is totally the antithesis of what I would like to think the meaning of Jewish behavior really is. We have all these people who are willing to claim responsibility for a man's death. Just think of the lack of Jewish value in life that represents for these supposed learned men. It is a saga of lack of Jewish ethical value, almost, for me. I may be totally confused about the purposes of claiming to be responsible for this man's death, when in essence, the man was almost innocent in the entire story. And it remains a baffling story to me, because it's not typical of how the Talmud stories of all these weeks have taken us to the positive side of learning. The ethical values that we're supposed to be upholding. You've mentioned the midot. None of those are referenced here. There's no kindness. There's no sense of we are all equal under God's eyes. None of that comes through. So this story is extremely difficult for me personally. And, I may be the lone voice in that regard, but as each story should be giving you something, this one for me is wholly without intrinsic ethical value for me, at least.
All right, thank you, Jeff. That's interesting. I think you and I are reading this very differently, because I read this not that those rabbis, each of them, was proud that this man died, or that they were looking to be the one responsible in a good way, being like, I'm the one who was responsible for his death. I read this more as there's guilt behind each of them for this man's death, and they all feel the burden of responsibility for his death. That it wasn't that it was something that was applauded, but in fact, that even those, I read it as even those who are painful, destructive people in the world, that there's almost as if when we start to say, God, I wish they were dead, that is a line we're not supposed to cross that line, because it could, as in this case of Rav Ada bar Abba, lead to his death, or we could feel as though we are responsible for his demise, and we're not supposed to be the ones responsible for taking anyone else's life. And so I think this is also the rabbis' guilt and insecurity about, are they responsible for probably what was going on in their own heads, except for the last one, who actually articulates out loud, I'm waiting for his death, or his coffin. He's the one who who most purely references the man dying. But the others, we would imagine in their minds are saying, God, I wish this guy would die, or he's so frustrating, or their own anger at him, they feel led to his death. And so I think it's also supposed to be a story to remind us that when we are confronted by someone who is destructive, who is as inappropriate as Rav Ada Bar Abba was in all the instances that are referred to in the story, that he clearly was a troubled man. He clearly was not living a life of Musar. And when we are tempted to curse those people so strongly, that we have to also be aware of the impact that our negative feelings can have on other people. Just like his negative feelings clearly had a detrimental impact on all the people that he interacted with, that even the thoughts that we may have about other people that are negative, we have to just be aware of those. And the story, I don't think, goes as far to clearly overtly say your thoughts can lead to death, because we are a people of action. We're very much more on the lines of how you act in the world has repercussions, not the way you think. You can think whatever you want, but once you start acting on those thoughts, that's the problem. And I think maybe this is a warning that be aware that your thoughts could lead to certain actions. And in this case, the rabbis fear that their thoughts about this man and their anger and destructive feelings towards him because of how he acted towards them, that this is a warning that be careful, because you may inadvertently lead to more destructive behavior in the world, that we don't want to be a part of that cycle of negativity and destruction, that we have to be very aware that we are not perpetuating that, we're not adding to that. Can we somehow do whatever we can to stop it in its tracks? And so that's the way I read it. So clearly different than you, and that's of course the beauty of these stories, right? Is that we can read them from all different angles. And I think though, even with Jeff's interpretation, I think there are some learnings there. They're just warnings. It's the way you read it is more a warning about those rabbis than it is necessarily even about Rav Ada Bar Abba. So I still think there are lessons that we can gain from no matter how you read this story. But thank you for bringing up that interpretation and that perspective. I think that's really helpful. Let's go. Pamela said, none of these people actually caused the death though. So these are their individual reactions to how they treated the person, and each taking responsibility as though they wish they had acted differently. Okay, great. Thank you, Pamela, for those. Given the time, we're almost at the end. I know we always could continue diving more and more into these stories. But I do want to leave a little time now for us to kind of just wrap it up. And so I do want to turn to the final piece, which is the blessing and this idea of the siyum, which I mentioned over the last 2 weeks, is what happens when you finish usually a tractate of Talmud, which is a section of Talmud. It comes from this passage, a very, very small line from the Talmud, Shabbat 118b. On the very bottom of that page, it says, and Abaye, same Abaye we referenced in the story above, said, may I receive my reward, because when I see a young Torah scholar who has completed a tractate that he studied, I make a feast for the sages. This is the reference that led to the concept of the siyum, which is this idea of when you have finished the section, you have a feast, you celebrate that you have finished your learning for this section. That, of course, it's the end of a season, so to speak. You're supposed to continue to learn, but that this is the conclusion, and that you celebrate marking the beginning and the end. We're, of course, at the start of the Torah again. It's appropriate time that we are ending this week. Simchat Torah coming this weekend, and then starting next week, technically around the world, is Bereshit. We have ended the cycle and begun a new one. We've, of course, begun a new Jewish year, and we are ending one piece of our learning with the goal being that we can continue to learn, not just Talmud, but that it leads to other types of learning. So I want to just read this excerpt from the Hadran prayer, which is the prayer that traditionally is offered when you finish a tractate, and it's linked to the Hebrew. Hadran is Aramaic, but it comes from the Hebrew root. If you were to look at the Hebrew equivalent of the Aramaic, to the root of return. So this idea of return, it's an interesting way of understanding what does it mean to return when you're coming to the end of something? So I would love just to read this out loud to all of you, and imagine that you are saying it with me, because if we were all together and we were in a format where everyone's voices could be heard at the same time, without without Zoom, I would want us to say this all together. So feel free to say it out loud if you want, as I read along, or just in your own mind. But I do want to read this to you. We will return to you, tractate, whatever it may be, and you will return to us. Our mind is on you, and your mind is on us. We will not forget you, and we will not forget us, not in this world and not in the next world. May it be your will, our God and God of our fathers and mothers, that we should be loyal to your Torah in this world, and it should be with us in the next world. Please make it sweet, Adonai our God, the words of your Torah, in our mouths and in the mouths of your nation, the house of Israel. And it should be that we, all of us, our children and the children of your nation, the house of Israel, that we should all know your name and learn your Torah. Your commandment makes me wiser than my enemies, for it is ever with me. Let my heart be complete in your statutes, in order that I may not be put to shame. I will never forget your precepts, for with them you have quickened me. Blessed are you, O God, teach me your statutes. May it be your will, Adonai, my God, just as you have helped me to complete this Talmud study, so too may you help me to start other tractates and books, and to complete them, to learn and to teach, to observe and to enact and to fulfill all the words of the teaching of your Torah with love. And may the merit of all the Tanaim and Amoraim and Torah scholars be present for me and for my descendants, to ensure that the Torah does not depart from my mouth and from the mouths of my descendants for all eternity. And may the following be fulfilled for me. When you walk, it will lead you. When you lie down, it will watch over you. When you awake, it will speak with you. For through me, your days will be multiplied, and the years of your life will be increased. Length of days is in her right hand, in her left riches and honor. God will give strength to his nation. God will bless his nation with peace. Amen. Again, thank you all so much for bringing such light and inspiration to me during this pandemic. These last 29 weeks, truly, I'm getting emotional just thinking about how we have formed this community, even though you only get to see me, and we get to hear each other's voices, but the way in which we've learned together has been very special for me. And I am so appreciative of all your insights, of you taking the time out of your week in the craziness of our world to learn with me, to learn Talmud. May this only be the beginning of your Talmud study. May we continue to learn together, and may the lessons that we have learned from these classes and these amazing Talmud tales help us to improve ourselves, improve our community, improve our society, improve the world, so that we may all come to a place of peace, and may we continue to be inspired. So thank you for inspiring me. Of course, if you ever need to reach out to me, feel free to reach me at rabbijoel@wbtla.org. And I look forward to learning with you again in the future. So thank you, and the best to you and yours. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and early Shabbat Shalom.